I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory there is no survival.
One advantage of the fanatical left-wing assault on British history is that it necessitates a better understanding of our past by all those who wish to mount a valiant defence. In 2002, a nationwide poll attracting over 1 million votes named Winston Churchill the greatest Briton of all time. Naturally, this begs the question, why? How would you go about explaining this result to a citizen of a foreign land, or, better yet, a Martian visiting from some distant planet? He was a soldier, you might say. Yes, but so was Lord Nelson, whose triumph at Trafalgar kept us safe from Napoleon's Grand Army and established British command of the seas for over 100 years. He was a writer, you cry. He was. A good one, who received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. However, if such an award had been around in his day, Shakespeare would have won it every year for a decade. I've got it. He was Prime Minister and he led Britain to victory in a global war. Indeed. And if such an achievement is all it takes, tell me why David Lloyd George, who'd accomplished the very same 30 years prior to Sir Winston, barely makes the list at all. What's so special about Churchill? Well, in a word, courage. Not just physical, although he certainly had plenty of that, but specifically moral courage, a commodity ever in short supply. Churchill possessed what Orwell called the power of facing unpleasant facts, the wisdom to realise what must be done, and the guts to do it against all odds. Put simply, he never gave in.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
It doesn't surprise me, therefore, in an age of moral cowardice, when victims are lionised and victors maligned, that far-left fantasists would seek to smear a man who so brightly shines a light on their own inadequacies. It's common now for any public debate on Sir Winston to feature some fabricator or other eager to decry him as a racist or mass murderer with as much blood on his hands as the dictator he defeated. A healthy society would simply dismiss these publicity-hungry goons with a funny look, were they not supported by a mob of Twitter morons happy to swallow the tallest tale if it's tweeted often enough. Now, I want to be clear, Churchill was as fallible as the next man. He made mistakes, and I don't have much time for any definition of hero that presumes perfection on the part of the assignee. As far as I'm concerned, an individual deserves admiration if they act above the common herd to achieve great things, and by that standard, Sir Winston has earned his statue 3 times over. Nevertheless, reasonable detractors will point to blunders at Gallipoli, his fudging of the gold standard, the abdication crisis, etc., as blots on his record, and there are certainly debates to be had between fair-minded historians. What we are about to see, however, is not that. Right? This video, produced by the Indian network World is One, is not history. It is character assassination of the most obvious kind. It's bollocks, basically. However, it is systematic bollocks, and it contains 10 of the most popular canards you will encounter during a debate with a Churchill hater, and to that end, I hope the responses I provide will be of some use to you.
If any words that I have spoken have commanded attention, that is only because they find an echo in the breasts of those of every land and of every race who love freedom and are the foes of tyranny.
Now, any argument I rely on will be supported by either the primary sources or prize-winning academics in the field, people like Martin Gilbert, Churchill historian and honorary fellow at Merton College, Oxford, Victor Davis Hanson, military historian and visiting professor at Stanford University, Arthur Herman, who received his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins, Andrew Roberts, Cambridge graduate and author of Walking with Destiny, recently described by the New York Times as the best single-volume biography of Churchill yet written. In other words, experts. And although their reputations don't make them right, when you realise that the people they refute aren't even historians, for the most part, you'll start to sympathise with that old maxim, a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can pull its pants up. Let's dive in.
A wartime Prime Minister, celebrated statesman, touted a hero of the free world. Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill is remembered in Britain as one of the land's finest. After all, he saved the country from a Nazi invasion. But to the world outside Britain, Churchill was hardly better than Hitler.
Don't laugh. I know you're laughing, but this is the yarn that is spun. Now, hats off to these people in some respects, because they have managed to display a fantastic degree of ignorance about two of history's most significant individuals in a single sentence, which is quite an achievement. First of all, Churchill's reputation is fairly good internationally, by the way. We know that he was made an honorary citizen of both France and the United States after the war. We know that various statues of him are displayed publicly in no less than 18 countries. And we know that modern-day films that portray Churchill in a positive light are commercially successful even in countries like India. So this idea that he's universally despised outside of the British Isles doesn't stack up. And secondly, if you really want to put Churchill on the same moral plane as Adolf Hitler, you'll have to come up with a list of charges that are roughly equal to the creation of a fascist state in which all citizens are disposable property, the invasion and subjugation of 22 neighbouring countries, the systematic execution of 11 million Jews, gypsies, homosexuals and blacks, the conducting of medical experiments on live prisoners, the mass murder of civilians in occupied territory, and the triggering of a global war that led to the deaths of 80 million people. So we'll see if you manage that throughout the course of this presentation. But look, if it's all too much work, why not conduct a simple thought experiment? Imagine an Axis victory in 1945 resulting in a Nazi-occupied Europe and a Hirohito-occupied Asia. What would the world look like today? And how long do you think you'd last in it?
To the West, he was a fierce imperialist. Imperialism being a validation for Churchill's racist mindset. The racism is well documented. "I hate Indians," Churchill once wrote. "They are a beastly people with a beastly religion."
Churchill was a racist. Now, leaving aside the fact that many of the people levying this accusation think that all white people are inherently racist, so I'm not entirely sure they're arguing in good faith. The truth is, Churchill did loosely believe in a hierarchy of race, which, as far as the post-Darwinians were concerned, was scientific fact. Okay, getting crossed with him about it is a little bit like raging against John Locke for invoking tabula rasa. I mean, it's a nonsense. This was mainstream opinion in his day. Gandhi, for example, said appalling things about blacks, and Karl Marx not only used the N-word like it was going out of fashion, but even wrote a defense of slavery. Churchill, by contrast, would often articulate profoundly anti-racist ideas. In 1920, for example, he wrote, "There can be no greater mistake than to attribute to each individual a recognizable share in the qualities which make up the national character. There are all sorts of men, good, bad, and for the most part, indifferent, in every country and in every race. Nothing is more wrong than to deny to an individual, on account of race or origin, his right to be judged on his personal merits and conduct." In 1932, in an abortive attempt to get him to meet Hitler, Churchill told the German press secretary, "Why is your chief so violent about the Jews? Why should you be against a man because of his birth? How can any man help how he was born?" When that was reported to him, Hitler declined the meeting, by the way, because these questions reveal a crucial distinction between the two men. Churchill's racism, to the extent it existed, was paternal in nature. It wasn't based on demonization. Kipling-style imperialism always believed that the British had a responsibility to care for and civilize the peoples of the world, and that anybody could be taught to embrace a higher civilization. Now, you can say that's wrong, you can say that's condescending, but to pretend, as some now do, that these attitudes are the moral equivalent of the Nazi desire to enslave and ultimately exterminate what Hitler calls the Untermenschen in Mein Kampf, right, is ridiculous. I mean, it's flat out ahistorical.
The racism is well documented. "I hate Indians," Churchill once wrote. "They are a beastly people with a beastly religion."
The way this quote is bandied about, you'd think it was written on Clementine's buttocks. That line is lifted from the diaries of Leo Amery, Secretary of State for India. So Churchill didn't write it, for a start. And secondly, if you examine the context, you'll note that it was said once, in private, and out of frustration with Indian separatists who at the time were refusing to resist the Japanese and contribute to the war effort. And don't forget, Churchill was an equal opportunity offender, right, who regularly insulted both his friends and enemies. He once said of Americans, for example, that they were arrogant and fundamentally hostile. He called Clement Attlee a sheep in sheep's clothing and Charles de Gaulle Joan of Arc in trousers. I mean, this is what he was like. But to present that quotation as a thesis, right, as a summary of the man's views on Indians is, again, a complete distortion of the record. Once the war was won and he could reflect dispassionately on the Indian contribution overall, he wrote, "The loyalty of the Indian army to the King Emperor, the proud fidelity of their treaty to the Indian princes, the unsurpassed bravery of the Indian soldiers and officers, both Muslim and Hindu, shine forever in the annals of war. Before that, he'd defended the rights of Indian minorities in South Africa, which Gandhi himself would later recognise. He famously denounced the massacre of Indians at Amritsar, calling it utterly monstrous in the House of Commons. And once the India Act of 1935 was passed, granting more autonomy to the provinces, Churchill began to support the Indian nationalists and advise them on how to improve the country. My test of success is improvement in the lot of the masses, morally as well as materially. I do not care whether you are more or less loyal to Great Britain. I do not mind about education, but give the masses more butter. Tell Mr. Gandhi to use the powers that are offered and make the thing a success. I am genuinely sympathetic towards India. I've got real fears about the future. But you've got the things now. Make it a success, and if you do, I will advocate you getting much more. Gandhi responded positively to this advice, remarking that he had a good sense of Churchill and knew he could always rely on his sympathy and goodwill. Now, does this sound like a man who hates Indians and wants the worst for them? On the contrary, Churchill was proud of how the population had increased under British rule. He had close Indian friends like Nehru, whom he called the Light of Asia, and he did what he thought was best to keep the people there safe and prosperous. At lunch with the King's private secretary in July 1943, he declared, "The old idea that the Indian is in any way inferior to the white man must go. We must all be pals together. I want to see a great shining India, of which we can be as proud as we are of a great Canada or a great Australia." Some racist.
The hatred was not all words. Churchill engineered the 1943 Bengal Famine. During the Second World War, Britain exported wheat from India, Allied troops were fed, while Indians went to bed hungry. Churchill stopped all food supplies to India. 4 million people starved to death in Bengal in 1943. It was not imperial mismanagement. The famine was a classic case of racism. But Churchill blamed Indians for breeding like rabbits.
The idea that Winston Churchill was in any way responsible for the Bengal famine really is a most appalling libel and stems solely from one book published by a non-historian that has since been comprehensively debunked. And to be fair to Mukerjee, not even she goes as far as to say that Churchill engineered the thing, only that he exacerbated it, which is still untrue, as I'll demonstrate. But this new attempt now to brand him the puppet master of the event, I mean, I wish you could libel the dead, is all I'll say, because Nicholas Soames or whoever should be able to sue for defamation like that. The truth is, in October 1942, a cyclone hit Bengal and Orissa, destroying the rice harvest. The Muslim-dominated local administration dealt with the problem corruptly and negligently. British Raj officials also failed to get a grip on the situation, and Indian merchants, upon seeing grain prices skyrocket, began hoarding their crop, often egged on by Hindu nationalists looking to embarrass the Muslim officials. To make things worse, the Japanese had already captured Burma, Malay, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, countries that were traditionally called upon for aid during times of famine. It was a terrible instance of 100 things going wrong at once. But when Churchill was first told of the severity in late 1943, he wrote to Lord Wavell, the Viceroy of India, "The material and cultural conditions of the many peoples of India will naturally engage your earnest attention. The hard pressures of world war have for the first time for many years brought conditions of scarcity, verging in some localities into actual famine, upon India. Every effort must be made, even by the diversion of shipping, urgently needed for war purposes, to deal with local shortages. Wavell began using the army to redistribute food from areas where it was plentiful to those directly affected by the famine. Churchill, meanwhile, turned to Australia, which promised to send 350,000 tons of wheat, and to the Iraqis, who could provide 25,000 tons of barley per month. The cabinet struggled to meet India's demands throughout the war while taking into account the threat of Japanese submarines present in the Bay of Bengal. Wavell himself noted, "All the Dominion governments are doing their best to help." In 1944, despite preoccupation with the imminent invasion of Normandy, Churchill wrote to FDR, "I am seriously concerned about the food situation in India. Last year we had a grievous famine in Bengal, through which at least 700,000 people died. I have had much hesitation in asking you to add to the great assistance you are giving us with shipping, but a satisfactory situation in India is of such vital importance to the success of our joint plans against the Japanese that I am impelled to ask you to consider a special allocation of ships to carry wheat to India from Australia without reducing the assistance you are now providing for us, who are at a positive minimum if war efficiency is to be maintained. We have the wheat in Australia, but we lack the ships." Roosevelt was unable to help. The awful truth about the famine is that the toll on shipping since the start of the war had stretched the Allies to breaking point by 43-44. Britain was still fighting for survival, and there were dire food shortages in many countries, including Greece, Holland, and Italy. And yet, all of Churchill's correspondence throughout that period makes it clear that he was sympathetic, and many historians argue that if he hadn't taken the actions he did, the famine would have been worse. Supposed evidence to the contrary rests solely on a few off-colour comments about Indians that have been yanked from context and are now used to suggest he wanted 2 million people to starve because he hated them. I mean, it's preposterous. The breeding like rabbits line, for example, taken again from an entry in Amory's diary that nobody bothers to read in full. Winston, after a preliminary flourish on Indians breeding like rabbits and being paid $1 million a day by us for doing nothing about the war, asked Leathers for his view. In other words, after sounding off about the Indians like some grumpy old man, he then asked his transport secretary how they could be sent food.
Churchill's xenophobia is also exposed in his support for gas bombs. During the Arab uprising of 1920, he lamented the squeamishness of his colleagues who were not in favor of using poison gas against so-called uncivilized tribes.
I'm amazed people still repeat this canard, which is a famous instance of quote mining. I mean, they are referencing a departmental minute from 1919, and here is the remark in full. "I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of gas. We have definitely adopted the position at the peace conference of arguing in favour of the retention of gas as a permanent method of warfare. It is sheer affectation to lacerate a man with the poisonous fragment of a bursting shell, and to boggle at making his eyes water by means of a lacrimatory gas. I am strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. The moral effect should be so good that the loss of life should be reduced to a minimum. It is not necessary to use only the most deadly gases. Gases can be used which cause great inconvenience and would spread a lively terror, and yet would leave no serious permanent effects on most of those affected. He's talking about tear gas, demonstrably. He's arguing for the use of a more humane form of warfare in the place of bombs and bullets. Now, he confuses the matter slightly with the use of the term poison gas, which carries a broad meaning, but it's clear from the rest of the quote that he wants to minimize the loss of life by using the same tactics currently deployed by police forces all over the world. A sentiment corroborated a week later when he addresses the India office. If it is fair war for an Afghan to shoot down a British soldier behind a rock and cut him in pieces as he lies wounded on the ground, why is it not fair for a British artilleryman to fire a shell which makes the said native sneeze? It is really too silly.
The same year, Churchill sent the Black and Tans into Ireland. The murderous militia were tasked with terrorizing the Irish and defeating the Irish rebellion.
The situation in Ireland is interesting, and although Churchill didn't send in the Black and Tans, as the historian Paul Addison writes, he seems to have played no part in the initial decision to recruit them. He was, however, slow to condemn their actions when they got out of hand. This was, of course, during the Irish War of Independence of 1919, when Churchill was Secretary of State for War, and the Black and Tans were known for their brutality. They would conduct reprisal killings against revolutionary villages, and sometimes even murdered innocent people in that pursuit. And Churchill has been reasonably criticised, in my view, for allowing these excesses to go on as long as they did. You mustn't forget the second half of the story, though, because the war did come to an end on Winston's watch. He did, before long, focus on the diplomatic route, and dishonest actors will often omit that part. It was Churchill most prominently who brought the warring parties together, not only the British government and Irish revolutionaries, but after the treaty was forged, Michael Collins and Ulster Prime Minister Sir James Craig. This very treaty gave birth to the Irish Free State, which would later become the Irish Republic, and was the basis for a peace in Ireland that would last half a century. After it was signed, Michael Collins, one of the leading Republicans, even sent a personal message to Churchill. Tell Winston we could never have done anything without him.
In the year 1949, Churchill ordered the British Army to fire on the anti-Nazi protesters in Greece.
That was so badly framed, I'd hang it in the Tate Modern. They weren't anti-Nazi protesters, for a start. They were pro-communist insurgents. And it was 1944, not 1949. But apart from that, stellar summary, guys. Well done. The background here is that at the Fourth Moscow Conference, Stalin had agreed to basically leave Greece to the Democrats. And the EAM, an Athens-based socialist guerrilla group, unhappy with that decision, initiated a general strike that led to civil war between rival political factions. And yes, Churchill said in a telegram to his general Robert Scobie, "Do not hesitate to fire at any armed male in Athens who assails the British authority or Greek authority with which we are working. Do not hesitate to act as if you were in a conquered city where a local rebellion is in progress. It would be a great thing for you to succeed in this without bloodshed if possible, but also with bloodshed if necessary." And too right. I mean, if communist revolutionaries were trying to overthrow my government, I hope the military would do something about that. I don't know about you. 28 people were killed, some of those at the hands of the Greek police, by the way. But look, Churchill was very clear on this, and politicians of the day should take note. The last thing that resembles democracy is mob law. Democracy is no harlot to be picked up in the street by a man with a Tommy gun. I trust the people, the mass of the people, in almost any country. But I like to make sure that it is the people, and not a gang of bandits from the mountains or from the countryside who think that by violence they can overturn constituted authority, in some cases ancient parliaments, governments, and states. He then travelled to Athens on Christmas Day, 1944, and brokered an agreement between the various sides that would see the British withdraw and, despite some bumps along the way, save Greek democracy. And when you consider the suffering nearby countries like Romania and Bulgaria were about to endure for 50 years under Stalin, I mean, you'd have to be nuts to deny that Churchill's efforts for freedom in Greece rank alongside his greatest achievements.
He also facilitated Zionism in Palestine. Palestinians were barbaric hordes who are little but rabid dung, he wrote.
No comment?
Churchill justified the colonization of Australia.
I thought this was a list of criticisms. I justify the colonisation of Australia. Oh, and on that barbaric hordes comment, by the way, that's hearsay. Now, it's true, Churchill didn't like the Palestinians very much because, go figure, but there's no hard evidence that he ever said that. Not that it matters. I'll say it right now. The Palestinians are barbaric hordes. They are today. So imagine what they were like back in the 20s. Fuck me. As for rabbit dung, I don't know what they're eating, to be honest. Pizzas, by the look of them. But I digress. As for Australia, look. He put it in Victorian language that I wouldn't invoke today. But does anyone want to deny that the British colonisation of Australia has been a net win for the world? Let's do an Oxford Union debate on that one. When we showed up, they could just about manage the spear. Fast forward 200 years, and it's $1 trillion economy that's given us the pacemaker, Google Maps, and Margot Robbie. Give me a break. Oh, and on the subject of race, while we're here, much like the poison gas comment, Churchill wasn't always as precise with his terminology as he could have been, and sometimes used words in a manner that we would find strange today. He would say race, for example, when he really meant nation. Okay? He would say things like the British race all the time and contrast it with the French race. Which is why, unless you spend a lot of time reading his work, studying his speeches, and assessing his many actions over a lifelong lived, it's very easy to come away with a false sense of who he was and, ipso facto, a false sense of history, which is what we're getting right here.
In South Africa, Churchill planted the seed to strip the voting rights from the black communities.
Wow, that's a low blow. Look, I'm not going to adjudicate on a complete history of apartheid here, and anyone who claims to be able to sum that mess up in a single sentence is selling something. I do know, however, that from his first encounter with South Africa in 1899, Churchill was famously pro-native, and there are endless examples of this. During the Boer Wars, when he was captured in Pretoria, he argued with his jailer, who was mocking Britain's racial policies. Well, is it right that a dirty Kaffir should walk on the pavement without a pass too? That's what they do in your British colonies. Brother, equal? Ugh. Free? Not a bit. We know how to treat Kaffirs. Educate a Kaffir? Ah, that's you English all over. No, old chappie. We educate 'em with a stick. Treat 'em with humanity and consideration. I like that. They were put here by the God Almighty to work for us. We'll stand no damn nonsense from them. Insist on their proper treatment, will you? That's what we're going to see about now. We'll settle whether you English are to interfere with us before the war is over. Churchill was progressive by the standards of the time and wanted to expand liberties as much as possible in the face of opposition from all sides. We will endeavour to advance the principle of equal rights of civilized men, irrespective of colour. We will not, at least I will pledge myself, hesitate to speak out when necessary, if any plain case of cruelty or exploitation of the native for the sordid profit of the white man can be proved. He made it a condition of British support for a united South Africa, our right to be consulted effectively upon the native policy. I would not do anything for them without a sufficient return for the benefit of the native. This optimism went on, but so much of the situation was out of his hands, and certainly by the end, he couldn't control the mood in South Africa, is the bottom line. Don't forget that Jan Smuts, a friend of Churchill's and general sympathiser, lost the 1948 election, largely over this issue, following which apartheid was legally introduced by the Milan government in 1950. So throwing all of this at Churchill's door, when he, for the brief moment he had any authority in the region, had stood against depriving blacks of rights, is really unfair. But we've been seeing a lot of that today.
But despite all of this, Britain is blinded by its excessive admiration of Churchill.
I think they're done. We'll wrap up now with my favourite part of the discussion, the part where they tell us we have a distorted view of history. You've just watched these people present a tissue of lies, a pantheon of part truth, half truth, and downright untruth. Rampant disinformation demolished by me before your very eyes, and yet the challenge keeps coming from the mainstream. Why don't you teach this in schools? This is the problem. White man's history. Why lionize someone with such a record? Because it's not fucking true. That's why. And I have only just scratched the surface here. There is so much nonsense out there about Churchill. I'm surprised they didn't bring up Pearl Harbor, which he's supposed to have orchestrated, of course. Or what about Tony Pandy, where socialists assert he gunned down hundreds of Welsh miners? Some of this stuff, it's a fantastic read, and I've linked a bunch of material in the description, everything I've used and more. If you have a Sunday to browse through it, you'll see what I mean. No matter how many botched takedowns of Sir Winston you come across, however, I hope you won't lose sight of the big picture. The reality is, the only people out there who believe in utopia, the only people who seek to build the perfect society, and by extension, the perfect man, are totalitarian scrubs and fools. Okay? Winston Churchill wasn't perfect, and I could do a whole other video cataloguing the actual mistakes he made throughout his life, but if you think they in any way diminish his real achievements, if you think fallibility makes a great deed less impressive as opposed to more, you miss what it means to be human. We honour Winston Churchill for a very specific set of reasons. His wisdom, his strength, his eloquence, his leadership, and above all, his courage. He led this country to victory in the Second World War when defeat looked certain. We should have lost, and we should have lost quick. And if we had fallen before the Americans realized there was a war on, the world as we know it today would not exist. Freedom owes its second chance to Sir Winston Churchill, and it is a sad reflection of our times that nefarious fabricators, unfit to lick the boots of this man, are busy spreading fake history to try and make us forget that.
Many people think that the best way to escape war is to dwell upon its horrors and to imprint them vividly upon the minds of the younger generation. They flaunt the grisly photographs before their eyes. They fill their ears with tales of carnage. They dilate upon the ineptitude of generals and admirals. They denounce the crime and insensate folly of human strife. Now all this teaching ought to be very useful in preventing us from attacking or invading any other country, if anyone outside a madhouse wished to do so. But how would it help us if we were attacked or invaded ourselves? That is the question we have to ask. After all, my friends, only a few hours away by air, there dwells a nation of nearly 70 millions, of the most educated, industrious, scientific, disciplined people in the world, who are being taught from childhood to think of war as a glorious exercise and death in battle as the noblest fate for man. There is a nation which has abandoned all its liberties in order to augment its collective strength. There is a nation which, with all its strength and virtue, is in the grip of a group of ruthless men preaching a gospel of intolerance and racial pride, unrestrained by law, by parliament, or by public opinion. In that country, all pacifist speeches, all morbid war books are forbidden or suppressed, and their authors rigorously imprisoned. From their new table of commandments, they have omitted, "Thou shalt not kill." It is but 20 years since these neighbors of ours fought almost the whole world and almost defeated them. Now they are rearming with the utmost speed, and ready to their hands is this new lamentable weapon of the air, against which our navy is no defense, and before which women and children, the weak and frail, the pacifist and the jingo, the warrior and the civilian, the frontline trenches and the cottage home, all lie in equal and impartial peril. Now these are facts, hard, grim, indisputable facts, and in face of these facts, I ask again, what are we to do?
Do you think Churchill has sort of become, it's a flashpoint, isn't it? History has complex figures. These issues are deep, they're multifaceted, they're nuanced. And this sort of Churchill racist yes or no is not really a useful way of examining the issue.
Well, let me tell you something about this chap here, Sir Winston. In 1939, he stood, when that place there was against him, he stood behind the British people and defeated fascism and the Nazi Party all across Europe. And you wouldn't be stood here today, young man, talking to me if it wasn't for Churchill. There'd be a different statue there and there'd be swastikas flying over there. Well, that's me done.